All right, we should be ready to go.
Great. All right, welcome everyone. I think we'll wait just 1 minute or 30 seconds for anyone else that might be joining us here, and then we'll get started. All right, it looks like a few more folks joined us. That's great. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in then. Welcome everyone. My name is Emily Egan. I am the Assistant City Planner for the City of Elmhurst. And I want to thank everyone that's joining us for taking time out of their day to talk about biking and walking in Elmhurst. And I'm going to do just a very brief introduction of the project overall. This is an update to the bicycle and pedestrian plan. We had a plan previously, but this update is going to focus a lot on specific recommendations that are actionable and implementation focused. This plan will also help us take advantage of state and federal funding, and it will provide recommendations into the future that will make biking and walking safer and more convenient for Elmhurst. And we began this last year, summer of 2019, and we had a really robust round of public engagement that Heather will touch on later in the webinar. And we combined that with a lot of technical data like street widths and traffic counts. And with all of that information combined, we were able to create these draft recommendations that we're going to go over in this webinar. And so right now we're in the second round of public engagement, and we're really thankful for everyone's input and being involved in this plan. Please stay tuned as it progresses. We hope to take your input that we'll get at this webinar and many other occasions to get input, and then craft a draft plan, which we hope will be available in August later this year to bring back to the community and also to City Council to consider adoption. I wanted to also take a second to say thank you to the consultants who, you know, typically we do these types of engagement activities face to face, and we would prefer to be doing this in person, but obviously with the pandemic, that's not an option. So thank you so much for keeping the momentum going, and thanks to the steering committee for keeping this moving along and making sure that everyone has access to the information they need and that everyone's voice is heard during this process. Really appreciate it. So with that, I would like to introduce Mike Litwin. Unfortunately, his video isn't working at the moment, but he is a civil engineer with the City of Elmhurst, and he just has a couple comments to begin with.
Thanks, Emily. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So as Emily mentioned, these are draft recommendations put together by the consulting team and city staff. These are considered best practices, but these ideas and options that you see here might not work well in all cases due to something unique that we don't know about in a certain area that we're just not as intimate as some other people that in the city that live near there or work near there. So with that in mind, we're looking for any thoughts on the different options or any other ideas you may have to make sure that we get a plan that's really going to work. So please keep it in mind, it's just draft recommendations, and we'd love to hear what your comments are. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mike and Emily. And I think we're ready to go. Great. Next slide. So I'm Jackie Henriksen. I'm a planner with Civil Tech Engineering, and I'm part of the project team. And I'm also joined today by my colleagues, John McGill and Phil Hutchinson, Josie Willman, and Mike Fulkening, as well as our partner on the project, Heather Shady from Active Transportation Alliance. So just to give a brief rundown of what we're going to cover today. So first, this is new to us all, so we're going to give some tech tip overviews reviewing this webinar. And then we're going to go into a high level overview of the planning process and the timeline where we're at now. And then we're going to let you know what we heard in the first round of engagement. And then we're going to give an overview of the network recommendations and specific recommendations at intersections. And throughout this whole process, we're going to also have some polling questions for you. And just as a note, all of these polling questions will be totally anonymous. And then we will have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. And you can also ask questions all throughout. And then we'll discuss next steps for the plan process and becoming further involved in the recommendations. And then also just as a note, so we also did the same presentation earlier today, and it went about 10 to 15 minutes over. So in case it does, we will be, and you have to leave right at 6:30, we will be following up on all the unanswered questions and posting this recording to YouTube and on the project website. All right, so we have an introduction poll. So we are first asking you a few questions on how your transportation choices might have changed during COVID-19 and how you anticipate them changing in the future. So we will give you all about 20, 30 seconds to answer these. And once again, all of these answers are anonymous. Okay, I'll give you a few more seconds. All right, so it looks like out of the respondents, 100% of people, their transportation choices have changed since the stay-at-home order. 60% of people are frequently walking, 20% biking, 20% driving, and about 60% are anticipating long-term changes to their travel choices after the stay-at-home order. 20% no, and 20% are uncertain. All right, so to give a quick overview of the tech tips and some housekeeping. So if you encounter any tech issues during this webinar, you can go ahead and press the chat icon and we'll be watching that and we can provide answers and help you out. If you have any comments or questions specific to the recommendations that we're presenting, we ask that you submit them via the Q&A button, and then we will answer throughout, and we'll also reserve some time at the end to answer any outstanding questions. If for any reason you lose the internet, you can call in via the number where it says 5:30 p.m. 312-626-6799. Hopefully you don't though, because it is going to be highly graphical and very visual. And just to let you all know that this is being recorded and it will be posted on YouTube. And once again, the polling questions are anonymous. Okay, so to give a quick overview of the planning process. So our approach is greatly centered around the community engagement. So we had a very robust first round of community engagement when this project kicked off, in which we gathered input on the streets in Elmhurst and the different places and destinations that you would want to reach by biking and walking. And it's also data driven. We looked at different roadway data, we looked at crash data, different geometries and features of the road. And so we're going to take all of this together, and we developed the recommendations for all modes, all ages, and all abilities. So the idea being that somebody who is a youth or a senior could access these roads by any modes such as walking, biking, transit, or driving as well. And then all the recommendations are going to be focused on implementation. So we take an approach that we can consider more shovel ready. And the idea being that the city will have a roadmap. So when a project opportunity does become available, they can reference the plan and have an idea of what could be most appropriate on that street and further consider and study it. Okay, next slide, please. So Emily touched on this before, but this is just an overview of the timeline and where we're at in the process now. So as we mentioned, we started out with a round of community engagement, and we also looked at existing conditions. And then we took all that great draft feedback that we got, and we developed the recommendations, which we're presenting today. And something to emphasize is that, as Mike mentioned, these are draft recommendations. And it's really important that we get input from the community at this stage, because you all are the true experts as the people that live, work, and use these roads on a daily basis. So we will take these recommendations and the input from the community, and we'll revise them. And with the hopes of presenting to the City Council in August for adoption, and possibly we could potentially do an in-person event this summer with revised recommendations too, if that's possible. Next slide. And now I'm going to hand it over to our partner on the project, Heather Shady.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. So I'll talk a little bit about why we're doing this plan and what the benefits could be to implementing it. And I'll also give you a little background on the information we've gathered so far from the community in the first round of public engagement. So I think Emily gave a pretty good summary of why we're doing this plan update. We're looking at the streets from a new context, from sort of a more modern design approach, and trying to apply new recommendations to those. We're also hoping to develop an actionable roadmap that provides a lot of shovel-ready opportunities for the engineers in the city of Elmhurst. There's a lot of new funding available at the federal level and the state level, specifically for walking and biking projects. And by having this plan, Elmhurst will be well suited to apply for that funding and will be more competitive in those applications, which means more money will come in locally, and local budgets can be spent on other priorities. So this plan is really a plan for everybody in the community, whether you walk, bike, drive, or use some other mode of transportation. However, we do focus on the people who are most dependent on not driving to get around. So in any given community, including Elmhurst, about 30% of people aren't able to drive, either because they're too young, have aged out of driving, have a disability that prevents them from doing so, or are just simply can't afford a car. And we want to make sure that all communities are accessible to all people, including those who can't drive. So it's important to look at roads from that context and make sure that we're providing safe options for everybody. So by having a plan and implementing it over time, a community can see a lot of different benefits. I won't go into all the research and data, I'll just pull out a few key points. So one key is reduction in traffic congestion, which can also lead to better environmental impacts. Communities that encourage more walking and biking trips, they eventually will have more people walking and biking as forms of transportation, and therefore less traffic will be on the roads, which will lead to, like I said, better air quality and better traffic safety. In addition, there's economic development benefits to developing a bicycle and pedestrian plan and then implementing it. People who walk and bike to stores are more likely to spend more money over time at those stores than those who drive. And there's also other benefits. It may be easier to sell your home if you live on a street near or on bike or pedestrian infrastructure or have sidewalks. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've done to date in our first round of public engagement. As Jackie and Emily mentioned, we've talked to lots of different people throughout the community to get ideas and input on these draft recommendations. And I'll give you a little summary of who we spoke to. We've talked to both groups of people and individuals. So starting with some bigger events, we've tabled at different community events to reach a wide subsection of the community and talked to over 100 people. These include things like the fire station, open house, and the Elmhurst Cycling Classic. We hosted steering committee meetings that were made up of several members of local and regional groups, including Bike Elmhurst, Elmhurst College, DuPage County, the police department, and others. Then shifting sort of to more public engagement, we hosted an online map on Wikimapping where people were able to go and mark intersections, destinations, and difficult routes that they wanted us to look into. On that map, we had 121 people click individual markers and give us some suggestions and ideas, including 321 destinations, 201 difficult crossings, 67 difficult bike routes, and 89 difficult walking routes. And of course, there are overlap between all of these. You can see the map on the right shows where people plotted and told us about issues. We also held, sorry, Josie, back a little bit. We also held an online survey where 398 people responded, a public project website, which has already had over 1,000 visitors. And we held focus groups with 6 different community groups, including Elmhurst Hospital, Cool Cities, and others. Next slide, please. So we, in that survey that I mentioned that 398 people filled out, we asked a few key questions to get a sense of what people's preferences are for walking and biking. And one of the questions we asked was the top 5 factors that influence their decision to walk or bike somewhere. For pedestrians, one of the top ones was shoveled sidewalks in snowy conditions. So people told us that if there was no shoveled sidewalk at snowy times, they wouldn't walk somewhere. Followed by presence of sidewalks, ease of crossing at intersections, presence of trail or paths, and speed of traffic along my route. So these were the top 5 things that people selected in the survey amongst the choices we offered. For biking, the top choices were distance, interactions with drivers. So if it was a positive or negative interaction that might impact your decision to bike somewhere, comfort of crossings at intersections, presence of trails or paths, and conditions of the road on my route. So if there's potholes or leaves or snow, again, people may be less willing to ride their bike somewhere than they would if it were a clear route. Next slide, please. So we also asked people that responded to the survey how far they were willing to walk to reach a destination. Overall, about 78% of people that responded to the survey said they'd be willing to walk 1 mile to reach a destination, and 35% of people said up to 2 miles. So both those distances get you pretty far within the city of Elmhurst and could present with the right pedestrian improvements in the area, it could present an opportunity to capture more walking trips locally and reduce the number of driving trips. For cyclists, they told us that 71% of them told us that they're willing to bike up to 5 miles to reach a destination, which gets you pretty much throughout the city of Elmhurst. And 36% said they'd be willing to bike more than 5 miles. So these are people that are probably riding on the Prairie Path heading out to further locations and doing regional bike rides. Next slide. So I'll turn it back over to Jackie now, who is going to walk through the recommendations.
Great. Thank you, Heather. So, we're going to give a high-level overview of the recommendations. We're going to show you some examples of these on Elmhurst streets and show you the different design types that we're proposing. And then also just letting you know that there are more details on all of these, including maps of these specific locations on the story map, which Josie is going to talk about later on in the webinar. So first, we're going to start with recommendations that would be less protection and less intensive, such as marked shared lanes. And then as we progress through these, they're going to be more protected and more intensive, such as a trail. So first, marked shared lanes and bike boulevards. So both of these are pretty similar in that they are both on-street recommendations. and they involve bicyclists sharing the lane with cars. And as you can see at the bottom, there are pavement markings that indicate where cyclists should best position themselves to either stay out of the door zone or so cars can pass them in the safest way possible. So the big difference is that marked shared lanes are mostly utilized on streets where cars would be encouraged to pass the cyclists, whereas bike boulevards are more known as bike priority streets. So they would be streets in which there are lower traffic volume, lower speeds, often in residential areas, and the cyclists are encouraged to take the lane, and they're often coupled with other sorts of design treatments that calm traffic and make it a safer environment for pedestrians and cyclists. So you can see, and we'll have these throughout this webinar. So on the left side, there's an example of how the geometry of the roadway could change to accommodate marked shared lanes. And then on the right side, we have a conceptual rendering of what this could look like on Poplar Avenue. And then we also have some key street examples of where these could be located. And once again, you can visit the story map to see other locations. So some key streets would be Spring Road, which was recommended as, or it was identified as a top priority for north-south connections to the Prairie Path during the first round of community engagement. And then also Euclid Avenue. And then bike boulevards, we see these as potentially on Poplar Avenue, 3rd Street, Prospect, Mitchell, and Madison Street. And now we will have another poll, which I will initiate. All right, so these questions are asking if you would be more likely to bike with these recommendations and how comfortable you would feel. All right, we'll give a few more seconds for people to vote. All right, so it looks like if these designs were implemented, 100% of people would be more likely to bike in Elmhurst, and 44% would feel very comfortable, 44% somewhat comfortable, and about 11% would be neutral. All right, so next we'll talk about advisory bike lanes and conventional bike lanes. And these are very similar in that both of these designs provide a dedicated lane for cyclists on the street that is differentiated from the vehicle lane. The difference is that advisory bike lanes are implemented on streets where there isn't quite enough room for the typical conventional best practices width for a bike lane. And so this is indicated with a dashed line. And the thought here is that most vehicles can stay out of the bike lane, but if there are heavier vehicles such as freight or a bus, they could yield to a cyclist and utilize the outer part of the bike lane if they needed to. So some examples of these, you can see them here. The advisory bike lanes would be Spring Road and West Avenue, which West Avenue was also identified as a top priority for a bike route during community engagement. And then the conventional bike lanes, you can see an example that we are proposing on York Street. And then, so that would be, there would be multiple options on York, and also Spring Road is another street with multiple options, which I'll talk more about later on. All right, and we have another poll. All right, I'll give a few more seconds. All right. So it looks like 100% of people would be more likely to bike in Elmhurst if bike lanes were implemented, and 50% would be very comfortable and 50% would be somewhat comfortable. All right, then up from there on the protective design scale would be buffered bike lanes and protected bike lanes. And these are similar to the other ones in that they are also on-street designs on the pavement. But the differences here would be that the streets allow more width, and so you could give more protection, and the bike lane could be physically wider. And these are often on higher traffic, higher speed streets where that additional protection is needed. So buffered bike lanes, this example here, so the buffer could be placed either on the outside of the bike lane, providing more space between the bicyclist and traffic, or on the inside, which would help keep the cyclist from the door zone of parked cars. So that could be in business districts where there's a lot of parked cars potentially. There's an example of a buffered bike lane existing on Addison in downtown Elmhurst right now. So then another example would be the two-way protected bike lanes. And this would be taking some extra pavement in the shoulder on Brush Hill Road and changing that space to a two-way protected bike lane. And we were thinking that this could help connect the Salt Creek Trail along Brush Hill Road to the hospital. So it could create that key connection in the network. And we have another poll. All right, I'll give a few more seconds. Okay, so it looks like 100% of people would be more likely to bike in Elmhurst if these were implemented. 70% would feel very comfortable and 30% would feel somewhat comfortable. So then the final recommendations that we have for bike facility types would be side paths and multi-use trails. So a side path is very similar to a trail in that it provides an off-street protected space for bicyclists to use, but it often runs alongside a roadway. These are often used on major roadways where it is not recommended for people to bike on the actual pavement of the roadway. So that's a great design example for those higher traffic volume, higher speed roads, such as St. Charles Road, Butterfield Road. And also something to note about both of these side paths and multi-use trails is that they could, of course, be used by people on foot as well. So, so they are wider than a traditional sidewalk, and they provide enough space for pedestrians and bicyclists to both use the space together. And then multi-use trails, there are a few examples of these in Elmhurst, such as the Salt Creek Trail and the Prairie Path. These are great assets for the community, and we are recommending a few other locations where trails could also be added, such as there is ComEd right-of-way in the northern part of the community that could potentially be used for a trail, and in Wilder Park. And then we'd also recommend having some bike route wayfinding signage. So we would actually recommend that on all of the recommended bike routes in the community. That way it helps people know the safe streets to bike on and the trails and the side paths for people who are less familiar with the network as a whole. And here is another poll. I'll give a few more seconds. All right, so 100% of people would be more likely to bike in Elmhurst if there were more these side paths and multi-use trails. 80% would be very comfortable, 20% somewhat comfortable. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to press the share results button, but here you can see it. All right, and then we have some, we identified some streets in Elmhurst that there were, from the information we have now, there are a few different options that could be feasible, but we aren't sure at this point what the best option would be, and further study would be needed in addition to more engagement. So we identified these different locations, and there's more details in the story map. So these are places where it's really important that we hear from you in the community on your thoughts on these potential options. And as Mike mentioned earlier, there are instances in which we might not be aware of different sorts of contexts or situations on these roadways, and you as experts of the community, it's really helpful to hear those. For example, Spring Road Business District, one of the proposals, option 1, would involve the removal of parking on one side of the street to fit in some bike lanes. And then another option would be marked shared lanes, and parking could stay on both sides of the street. And we heard from the business community that it's really important to keep that parking there. So insights such as those, hearing what your priorities are, your different thoughts on what could or couldn't work in the community is really important to us. And we'll consider those as we revise these recommendations. York Street, the section between Van Buren and Butterfield Road, is another example. So we're proposing bike lanes north of there, and then we would be proposing a side path on Butterfield south of there. So we have potential recommendations in this tight sort of high traffic area of how we could accommodate bike traffic. So one would be a buffered bike lane on one side of the street, side path on the other, or perhaps it's best to just go with a side path on one side of the street. But further study would be needed on this, and we'd love to hear your comments on this, especially in the survey. All right, and now I will hand it over to my colleague John to talk about some pedestrian improvements.
Thank you, Jackie. Here are a variety of pedestrian improvements that we view as a toolbox of sorts. To start with, 86% of survey respondents said the presence of sidewalks would increase their likelihood to walk more. So some of the strategies that we are utilizing are raised crosswalks. This causes the crosswalk to be flush with the sidewalk on either side for the pedestrian, and it creates a speed hump for cars, forcing cars to pay a little bit more attention to the crosswalk as they're crossing. Another tool are rectangular rapid flashing beacons. You've probably seen these around. These are crosswalk signage with a button that you can press, which in some cases activates lights, letting people know that there is somebody trying to cross, along with signage sometimes in the middle and improved crossing visibility. Pedestrian medians are a tool that you can use to cross the street in 2 phases if there's heavier traffic or people not obeying walk signs. And with this, there's some signage in the median itself, alerting drivers that there's a median with a curb, and drivers will try to avoid the curb. which can improve the safety of the crossing. The style of crosswalk we advise is the continental style of crosswalk, which is a high visibility crosswalk that is ADA compliant as well. And then a very obvious one is to improve the connections of sidewalks in the community. And to the far right, you can see on the map all of the gaps that exist in your community where sidewalks are not connected. And now a poll. So if the proposed pedestrian improvements were implemented, would you be more likely to walk in Elmhurst? 100% said yes. And rate the importance of sidewalk improvements to Elmhurst transportation system. 80% said very important, and 20% felt it's somewhat important. Here is our intersection improvement toolkit. This includes curb extensions, which shorten the distance that people need to travel in order to cross the street, which slows down cars because they face a curb as they come to the crossing. Wayfinding signage is extremely useful for helping people on bikes to know where local things are. We often will advise signage for things like schools, hospitals, parks, trails. Another tool are bike boxes. These are found at traffic lights where cars are stopped behind the stop bar. And one of the common ways that bicycles are hit by cars is that the bicycle is going straight and the car is turning right at the stoplight, and the two collide. And so bike boxes are a means that you can use to get bikes in front of cars so that they're more visible at the stoplight. Mini traffic circles are useful in smaller intersections that are very complex. These typically feature a mountable curb. The function of this is to make certain that things like fire trucks and ambulances can continue to access the roads on every side. As well, it simplifies a complex intersection by making all the traffic move in the same direction, so that when you're negotiating your way through as a pedestrian or cyclist, you have somewhat of an idea of which direction cars are going to be coming from. Another tool are bike crosswalks. These are dedicated crosswalks specifically for cyclists that are often adjacent to, not always, a pedestrian crosswalk. And these can be paired with other tools as well to enhance safety. And then the last is a corner island and right turn slip lane improvement. This is often called a pork chop because of the way that it's shaped. And one of the things that's great about this is it turns it into a multi-phase crossing for pedestrians. It provides a buffer because there's curbs. People don't want to hit the curbs. And it places the crosswalk road paint at the most favorable angle for visibility for cars to hopefully see pedestrians. Here is our concept for the York Flex Street. It's important to note that we are not proposing to remove parking or to remove accessibility of the road to cars. We are sort of changing the relationship between cars, pedestrians, and cyclists. So there's some placemaking elements, including festoon lighting. Festoon lighting enhances the visibility of the street while making people feel safer. Especially at night, it draws them to the area. Another is a gateway arch, in this case, City Center Plaza, which calls out the space as a destination and says this is a special environment that you're passing through a gate in order to access. We're advocating decorative crosswalks, which would dress up the downtown and add a kind of quaint old world feel to the crossings while enhancing safety. And flexible street design. This includes pavers across the roadway. Pavers typically cause people to drive a little bit slower, while it also, in the same way as the decorative crosswalks, improves, it sort of dresses it up, makes it feel more, more old world, has a different aesthetic to it. The curbs on all sides of this would be flush, and this sort of blurs the boundary between the roadway and the pedway. And one of the ways that we can justify that is with the use of additional street furniture. So things like bollards, trash cans, trees, benches, all of which are useful objects, but to people utilizing the space, but at the same time, sort of armors the street from cars, making certain that the cars stay in the road and the pedestrians are safe in the pedway. And now pull. %, feel that the Flex Street could have a positive contribution to Elmhurst downtown, while 9% feel uncertain. And it would be, I forgot to add that as a Flex Street, the space is flexible, which means that you can customize it to, if you have a festival or something like that, you can claim the space. Restaurants can move seating into parking temporarily in order to create additional space for people to be. Thank you. Connections to trails, Salt Creek Trail and Brush Hill Road. People are having difficulty getting from Salt Creek Trail to Brush Hill Road and vice versa. Currently, a lot of people are cutting through the housing there. And so we're proposing a switchback, which would give people a nice, easy way to transition down from the road down onto the trail. This has the bike lane on the left and the pedway on the right at the top of it, which sort of gives people a cue that they're entering a shared space. At the Prairie Path and York Street crossing, there's been some issues on both sides where motorists are going a little too fast and pedestrians feel a little nervous. And motorists have also been made nervous by bicycles going too quickly into the crosswalk. Currently, there's a RRFB crossing there. And we have two concepts that we would like to touch on. And 29% of survey respondents who walk or bike to Salt Creek Trail versus 64% ride their bikes. So some of the improvements that we're proposing here is to bump the crosswalks, the stop bars back and make the crossing at grade. So it's a raised crosswalk. Add decorative pavers to the road, which would have the benefits I mentioned, and adding chicanes, which are fences, to the Prairie Path itself which forces people to slow down before they enter the crosswalk. And then here is alternative B. This, instead of the fence chicanes, utilizes a fence with some green space to encourage people to cross a little bit slower, because you have to slow down in order to make those turns. And then when you cross, hopefully you're going a little bit slower. And we would leave the RRFBs in place in this instance. Now pull. Do you see the proposed trail connections encouraging people to use the trails? 90% say yes, and 10% feel uncertain. Do you see the proposed trail connections improving trail safety? 90% say yes, and 10% say no. Major corridor crossings. First is a very unusual crossing condition of Butterfield Road and York Street. Of survey respondents said ease or comfort of crossing at intersections would affect their decision to walk or bike. 77% of pedestrians and 78% of cyclists. So for Butterfield Road and York Street, we are proposing to straighten out all of the crossings, add the dedicated bike crosswalks, improve the crossing condition at all four legs, and add a enhanced pedestrian pork chop at the slip lane. And this would all work in conjunction with a side path, as well as improving the signage of the crossing condition at all four legs. Butterfield Road and Spring Road, there's a lot of issues in crossing this intersection. So we are proposing to add crosswalks, or improve the crosswalks and add some, improve or add the bike crosswalks, and dramatically improve the bicycle signage that directs bikes where to go. Additionally, we're proposing on Spring Road a bike path. It's a little hard to see, but it is drawn at scale. And this would give cyclists a place to go. And now poll. Do you see the proposed major crossing improvements encouraging people to walk and bike? Do you see the proposed major crossing improvements encouraging people to walk and bike? 90% said yes, 10% were uncertain. Do you see the proposed major crossing improvements improving safety for pedestrians and bicyclists? And 100% said yes. School crossings, major roads. 50% of survey respondents said that they walked to school. And so at the first intersection, St. Charles Road and Berkeley Avenue, currently there is no crosswalk at the intersection that's farthest from us in the perspective. So we're proposing crossing at that location, altering the stoplight timing and signage in order to facilitate the crossings, to add the continental style crosswalks at all three legs, and a pedestrian island with bollards to match the existing bollards at the high school track. At North Avenue and Emory Avenue, currently there is a pedestrian underpass, but some people have indicated that they don't feel very comfortable with it. And so we're proposing some at-grade crossing improvements, including dedicated bicycle crosswalks, improving the crosswalk conditions for pedestrian, or crosswalk conditions for pedestrians. And then on Melrose Avenue and Emory Avenue, we're proposing raised crosswalks, improved crossing conditions, and then the curbs would be mountable, so they would be the smaller curbs. And then in the perspective at the bottom, you can see how bollards are used to protect people as they cross the street. Additionally, there's an enhancement of crosswalk signage. And now, pull. Do you see the proposed school crossing improvements on major roads encouraging kids to walk and bike to school? 90% said yes, 10% were uncertain. Do you see the proposed school crossing improvements on major roads improving safety for kids walking and biking to school? 90% said yes, and 10% were uncertain. School crossings in neighborhood roads. Poplar Avenue, Cayuga Avenue, and Wilson Street is an unusually shaped intersection, which is located near Jefferson Elementary School. And to help people in this area to cross the intersection, we're proposing a traffic circle with a mountable curb and stop signs for everyone, including cyclists, coming off of the bike path. So we're adding signage to direct people, including into how to get towards the school. And on the bike path, we're proposing a sign which says yield to peds. So pedestrians would have priority on this. And the percentage of survey respondents who walk or bike to local parks is 64% pedestrians, 87% cyclists, and 50% going towards school. And for Poplar Avenue and First Street, there is the railroad here, and there is currently no sidewalk connection on East First Street. So we're proposing adding a sidewalk and improving the crossing conditions on both Berthoud Avenue and Avon Road, along with enhanced crossing. This would all become these would all become bike boulevards, which would feed bikes towards South Poplar Avenue. And now a poll. Do you see the proposed school crossing improvements on neighborhood roads encouraging kids to walk and bike to school? 90% said yes, 10% said no. Do you see the proposed school crossing improvements on neighborhood roads improving safety for kids walking and biking to school? 90% said yes, and 10% said no. Other kinds of crossing improvements. Carolyn Avenue and 3rd Street is located near a park and recreation center, and people go a little bit too quick down this street. So we are proposing 3 raised crosswalk crossings with additional room for bike racks in one location, dramatically improving the signage, including adding RRFBs and bike route signage. And this would all be in support of transforming East 3rd Street and into Carolyn Avenue into a bike boulevard. Church Street and York Street is an uncontrolled bike route crossing, and we are proposing to add bike lanes on either side of South York Street. And on East Church Street, which will become a bike boulevard, East Church Street would include bike boxes, which I mentioned from our toolkit earlier, improving the crossing conditions at all 4 legs. And in addition to the road paint, which designates the bike path, there could be green bike paint, which marks where motorists might have potential conflicts with cyclists, such as driveways. Now a poll.
And also, all of these polling questions are in general about all of the recommendations that we've presented so far, not just this slide. This question was a bit more extensive, so I'll give about 15 more seconds for everyone to answer it.
If the proposed improvements that we presented so far were made, would you be more likely to walk or bike? 100% said yes. If the proposed improvements were made, what do you think will benefit from them? Senior citizens, 63%, youth, 63%, Elmhurst College students and staff, 13%, bicyclists, 88%, pedestrians, 88%, drivers, 38%, metro riders, 63%, PACE bus riders, 13%, local businesses, 38%, homeowners, 63%. Which destinations would you be more likely to visit by foot or bike if the pedestrian and bicycle network were built? 63% said parks, 25% schools, 88% downtown, 63% Spring Road Business District, 50% York and Vallett Business District, 13% Elmhurst Hospital, 75% Illinois Prairie Path, 38% Salt Creek Trail, and 0 none of the above. And now I'm going to hand off to Josie.
Thanks, John. So as my colleague Jackie mentioned in this presentation, we also have another tool called Story Map. And what this tool does is it goes a lot more in depth into the recommendations that we've discussed throughout this presentation. And there's a lot more details for you guys to review. And also within the story map, there's a survey directly embedded within it. So you're able to give feedback through that channel as well. And so the link to the story map is included on the website, but there's also a standalone link to the survey. So that's an opportunity to get more feedback. And I've also heard there's been a few different issues as we're working through this with accessing the story map. So just want to give some quick tips so that you can get the best experience with it. So we do know that it's not compatible with Internet Explorer, although Microsoft Edge is. We've heard there is also some issues potentially with Safari. So if you can use one of the other browsers, that would most likely be preferred. We've also heard that older cell phone models may have some issues accessing it. So we do recommend doing this on a desktop. It also gives bigger images, so it's easier for viewing. And then additionally, if you aren't able to access the story map, we also have a lot of the images included within the survey. So that's another opportunity to be able to see without being able to access story map. And then as for next steps, we really highly encourage everyone to visit the story map just to get more details on the draft recommendations and what you already saw in this webinar. We also encourage you guys to take the online survey. That's the best way for us to get feedback and help inform our next round of recommendations for the network. And then as a reminder, any questions not addressed will be posted to the project website. And as always, contact us if you have any questions. That information is on the project website where there's a comment box available. We do read those, so we will be seeing them. And then please help spread the word if you can. The more people this gets out to, the better. So now we'll move into Q&A. I know we're a little bit over, so if you guys could stick around if you have questions. If not, again, these will be posted online, and then there will be, the webinar will be uploaded to YouTube. So if you guys want to add questions in that Q&A button. I think we did get some questions already that were answered while we were going through the PowerPoint.
I like David's comment in regards to the Flex Street. I think it is very appropriate for this particular time. So thank you for that comment.
Just give a little bit more time to see if any comes rolling in. And if not, I think we can end this and all right, so it looks like we got a question that came in, and I'm going to field this towards John. So if you could speak a little bit more about why the Flex Street in downtown on York, maybe some more of the benefits that might be available.
Sorry, technical difficulties. What was the question again?
Just if you could expand a little bit more about the Flex Street in downtown York, maybe why we picked that location and what other benefits it could bring to the city.
Sure, it was selected primarily because it's like a main thoroughfare, and so the concept is that this would be sort of like the crown jewel of the downtown. So the Flex Street concept is that it's a flexible space. So if you wanted to have some sort of festival, a street fair, something like that, or if a restaurant, cafe wanted to claim a parking spot, maybe there would be some sort of review process or something, but it would be possible to move some things into the roadway, and that would allow you to claim that space for seating for a restaurant. The curbs are flush, which sort of blurs the boundary between the roadway and the headway. And the general concept is that it's more of a shared space between pedestrians and motorists.
All right, thanks, John.
Certainly.
It's not looking like we have any other questions. I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to, oh, there is one more question that came in. Are there plans for more bicycle racks if people will be biking or benches around? Jackie, do you want to take a stab at this?
Sure. At this point, I think we recommended bike racks in one location, but in general, we were more focused on looking at bike routes and pedestrian routes than locating bike racks. But that's definitely an important thing to consider. And I know that the city has a few ongoing projects recommending bike routes. That's certainly something that if there are site-specific locations that you think that the city could use more bike routes, we'd love to hear that so we can incorporate it into the plan. But I think in general, the plan will address bike parking at more of a higher level, sort of programmatic and best practices and design standards when locating and siting bike racks.
And I
Yeah.
can chime in. I know that we have received grant funding, partial grant funding for long-term bike racks near the metro station, and I believe at one of the parking decks as well. So those are in the works currently.
And if I could also jump in from the city standpoint, please let us know where you'd want to see some. Maybe it's not on our radar and it's easier to put in than one could think. So unless we know, we wouldn't even think to look in that position. So please let us know where you're thinking about bike racks and potentially benches.
All right, so it's not looking like any other questions are coming in. We'd just like to thank you all for joining us, for those of us who are still with us. And then please give us feedback. We would love to get as much information as we can from you guys to update the plan and make it the best plan that we can for Elmhurst. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Nice job.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good night.